which admittedly some of them are listed as options, but nevertheless, we're looking at very, very serious amounts of money here, then there will be a police force, effectively. This government will have the right, for the first time ever in an international organization, to enforce its will by imposing unlimited financial penalties on any countries whose performance under this treaty they don't like. Now, I could go on and on and on and on, because there's pages and pages of this. There's an adaptation fund, a multilateral adaptation fund, solidarity funds, mitigation funds, multilateral climate technology funds.
A total global government takeover. A global government, sir. Is this total global government?
This is total global government, but on a scale which is simply unimaginable. I mean, the cost of all these extra boards and panels and technology funds and this and that, that's going to come out of general taxpayers' money over and above the various individual financial provisions I've just read out. We're looking at a grab for absolute power and absolute financial control worldwide by the UN and its associated bureaucracies and 700 new bureaucracies. And I'm not talking about 700 new bureaucrats, I'm talking about 700 new bureaucratic bodies. Who says how many hundreds of thousands of staff each of those will have?
Well, briefly,
they need an awful lot of money to pay for all that, and this is how they're going to get it. A series of funds and this and that and the other. I've never seen anything.
And global authorities over travel, tracking where everybody goes, expanding on that. Now we have the Danish leaked memo that they've been passing around, and I have that draft here, and it talks about, this is even upsetting some of the UN bureaucrats in the third world countries, that the power will be held by the IMF, the World Bank, and other quasi-private organizations. So we have a private corporate structure directly looting the population. Why is this horrifying the third world toadies that have since been taken over by the IMF and World Bank?
They want the UN to run everything because the UN, they now see as simply a sort of socialist cash-generating machine, a cash cow for third world countries. The UN no longer serves any purpose except first its own enrichment and then a little bit of trickle down after it's spent all that it wants on its own vast bureaucracies. And you know, there are 200 of those already, at least 200, represented here at this conference. Unbelievable alphabet soup of acronyms for these different, UNEPs and WMOs and WFFs and this and that, hundreds of them. And all of that being paid for almost entirely by the taxpayers of the West, and occasionally letting some money trickle down to third world countries, whose leaders, therefore, want to get this money for their own Swiss bank accounts. And they look to the UN as simply another source of cash. And so they're trying to buy, the UN is trying to buy these third world countries by saying, well, we're going to really make the developed countries pay. And the reason the third world countries are now so annoyed with the Danish draft, which was simply intended to try and facilitate agreement, but it got out into the Guardian before it had done its job, and therefore the Guardian has rather blown the negotiations out into the open. The reason why the third world countries are annoyed about this is because it isn't their friend, the UN, that will be running things. It's the much stiffer, much more business-like World Bank and IMF. Now, of course, the trouble is that from the point of view of Western countries, whether it's the UN or the World Bank and the IMF that's running this world government, one astonishing characteristic, and I've looked right through this treaty and I can confirm this, it's just the same as in the previous draft, the word election, democracy, ballot, vote, does not appear anywhere. The one thing that's quite clear is that these enormous powers of taxation and interference, enormous powers of levying this and taxing that and funding the other, are all going to be without any representation at all. Now, the old principle, as you know well, on which the U.S. Constitution is founded, is that there should be no taxation of any citizen unless the body taxing that citizen represents that citizen by being elected by him. No taxation without representation, it's called. But this world climate body, this world government, is not going to be elected by anyone. It's going to be a self-appointed, self-perpetuating bureaucracy, just like the EU commissars who now run the European Union and make 90% of our laws. We have a parliament, of course. It's more or less completely redundant.
Now, sir,
let it go into the Thames. Now, they're now trying to use that model and have it on an international scale with no election, no ballot, no vote, no right to call these people to account, no right to question them, no right to remove them, no right to replace them. This
so
is
when the United Nations,
democracy worldwide.
So when the United Nations says this is the greatest moment for world government, this is the year of the establishment of global governance, as the head of the EU and as Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN Secretary General, has said, they really mean it. And so we now stand here at the precipice. You are there in Copenhagen. Here's the big question. Looking at this, being inside of it, watching it, what do you predict is going to happen? And if we lose this and they do get it ratified, then we start fighting it at the national level. What do you see happening?
Let me tell you what worries me about all this. What worries me is this, that this treaty has been through several negotiating rounds. And yet, although they've taken out the word government, because I've screamed at them and you've screamed at them and everybody's screamed at them, all the mechanisms of government, all the funding sources, the funding streams, as they call them, or funding windows in the latest phrase, sounds very coy, but actually it means ways of raiding the taxpayer's pocket. All of these things are still in place and have not only survived the previous draft, but have been considerably amplified. So what we're looking at is, I'm afraid there's no other way of putting this, it is a worldwide conspiracy by the governing class against the governed, by the big boys against the little guy, by the rich against the poor, by the strong against the weak. And if you're a little guy doing your honest job of work to protect and pay for your family, you have good reason to be very frightened at this moment. And if you think that our kind host and I have been winding each other up and frothing at the mouth about something that's just another global government conspiracy theory, I just have 3 words for you. Read the treaty. As a result of the fuss I've made, there is a chance that by now, if you go on to the UN Framework Convention website, which I think is unfccc.int, then you may be able to find this treaty now in draft, because I have made quite a big stink about it not being immediately available when I asked for it. And I think they have been shamed now into putting this up on the web. It'll probably still be quite hard to find. Why don't you all have a look, if you doubt in any way what I've been saying to you about the magnitude and breadth of the scope of this treaty, the powers and the wealth that it will transfer from you and your country to an alien, unelected, communistic bureaucracy with power to control all free markets worldwide, with the power to levy taxes on every financial transaction that crosses an international border. We're looking at an enormous communistic government which, in its sheer scale, is disproportionate to any conceivable threat from CO2, particularly now that we know by measurement that all of the UN's models were wrong and CO2 is simply harmless. It's an outrage, and I'd like to tell you, if I may, what you should do about it. As soon as you have finished listening to this program, you must dive to the telephone, and you must telephone the U.S. Senate, and you must demand to speak to your senator or to one of his senior staffers. Do not be palmed off with a receptionist, a switchboard operator, a secretary, or an intern. You must speak to a senior staffer or to the senator himself, and you must ring both of the senators for your state, and they'll tell you on the switchboard who those senators are, and you must say the Treaty of Copenhagen shall not pass. The more of you do this, the more vigorously you do it, the more plainly, but always politely, you put your point to your senator and to his senior staff, the more likely it is that the Senate will refuse to ratify this treaty. And even though there are various backdoor ways by which Obama has already said via his staff during the election campaign that he would try to circumvent your Constitution by going round the back and allowing the treaty to be enacted into domestic law by a simple majority of both houses, or simply by signing it by his executive authority and then using his majority on the Supreme Court to say that that's the way the trend in law is moving, and therefore we'll count that as though it were a valid treaty. And the present Supreme Court will do that, you know, if you give it half a chance. And you need to make absolutely sure that your senators are told this treaty shall not pass, so that if any of these backdoor ways of pushing the treaty through against the will of the Senate are tried, the Senate will, if necessary, exercise the power that it has to establish the impeachment of your president if he does try what his staffers said during his campaign for election that he would try. So it's up to you now. You only have 10 days left of being a free country with a constitution of your own. Because once he signs that treaty, and with his Nobel Peace Prize and the millions of keening zombies screaming at him here at Copenhagen, he will sign anything. Once that happens, then it's bye-bye to your constitution.